background, have a little vibe in here. How y'all doing?
Hi.
We're good.
All right, are we live?
Is this
Can I get a
on?
thumbs up?
Oh, it is
Yep,
on.
we're good. We're good. Hello, world. My name is Karanda Cruz. I'm the founder of the Teaching with Purpose organization, where our mission is to spread and to provide culturally responsive professional development for educators across the state and the nation. We are super excited to have this forum here for you guys. To pretty much, we want to start conversations that will go beyond the election. That was the whole goal, the whole initiative, and the mission behind this whole forum that was created through a very powerful discussion that we've been having through social media. So that's the birth of this particular forum. So it was done at the very last minute, but I appreciate the candidates responding to the call, because that's what culturally responsive practice is to me, is how you respond to students and to families and to communities. Come on up. We have another candidate that just arrived here. So I'm going to step out the way. I'm going to have our moderator come up. He's a teacher here in our community by the name of Chris Reiser. I want you guys to, we don't have an audience, out in cyber land. Give it up for Chris Reiser.
Thank you for those of you who are tuning in live on the internet. Thank you for taking the time out of your Saturday evening to be here. I want to thank each of the members or the candidates for school board for taking the time out of your very busy schedule. I know this is crunch time. These are the final minutes and hours before we decide on who is going to be taking the helm in zones 4, 5, and 6 for the Portland Public Schools. So the way that we're going to start it off tonight is tell us your name, your zone, and just very briefly your mission and values, why you're running for the school board. So we'll start right here with you.
Hi, my name is Josie Simonis. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm running for Zone 6, which is in Southeast Portland. And I'm interested in a position on the PPS board because I believe that access to a quality education and a safe and supportive environment is a civil right, and that PPS is failing its students across the district. And I want to work to address those problems with real ground-up change and empower our teachers and our students and our community to work with and through the school board to actually address systemic inequities in our district.
Excellent, Josie. Thank you so much for introducing yourself, and thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Scott Bailey. I'm running in Zone 5. I've been a school advocate for almost 20 years. When my kids first started, they've graduated and gone through college. What I've done through my time, mostly what I've done is try to work at the district level to change the way the district works in ways that benefit all kids, especially historically underserved kids. That's what I'm about. It's all about kids. I think a lot of kids at Portland Public Schools do get a good, if not a great education, but way too many don't. And predominantly the kids that don't are children of color.
Thank you very much for being here.
Hi, I'm Virginia LaForte, and I'm also running for the school board seat in Zone 5. And in terms of what I'm all about, I am a mom of 2 young boys. I have a 7-year-old and an 11-year-old boy, and I have become, I call myself an accidental activist. I have been involved in the center of several issues that have become the center of turmoil at PPS, most notably the environmental hazards related to lead-based paint that have evolved into the bond that we all see on your ballot as well. I'm on the Bond Stakeholder Advisory Group. And I've also been involved in reworking the district-wide complaint process, actually for the entire state with the Oregon Department of Education, and also have done some work around policy change for TAG funding, which is a special service. And in 2013, when I first stumbled across it, I learned that it wasn't actually being tracked, and a lot of it was being returned to the general fund, which was interesting. It wasn't being used for the students that it was intended for, particularly in low-income schools and schools with high numbers of children of color, which is very problematic problematic. And we discovered this by pulling the budget for every single school and looking at it individually, because oftentimes that's really the only way you can see a problem at the school level. So that being said, I am very passionate about K through 12 education. My dad was a public school teacher. My mom was the associate director of admissions for the University of Montana. And I also worked in the music industry for a very long time in Chicago, developing young artists, and worked in music venues with their fans. So this is a really wonderful opportunity to marry my passion for youth, culture, and education, and be effective for every student in the district.
Thank you very much, Virginia.
Hi, my name is Rita Moore. I'm running for the Zone 4 seat in North Portland. And I grew up in a poor working class family in Boston. My father never graduated from high school. And I got a great public education, which allowed me to go to college, first in my family. Eventually, I got a PhD, and that's allowed me to have a life I never imagined possible when I was growing up. And I'm running because I want to make sure that all of our kids get the same kinds of opportunities that I had when I was little. And right now, they don't. We have at least 2 districts instead of 1. We have vast disparities in the kinds of educational opportunities and supports that are available to students across the district, depending on where they live and what school they go to. I started I've been in the trenches for about 15 years. I was a school representative during the K-8 reconfiguration mess in 2005. It was my first up-close and personal experience of PPS dysfunction. And I've been focused on fixing the systemic issues that are harming kids ever since. I've worked on enrollment issues, trying to make sure that we have an enrollment system that allows students to have full access to a core curriculum and electives and the kinds of opportunities they need. And I've also worked on the budget, trying to push the district to be more transparent about where our money goes. And I would continue those on the board.
Thank you, Rita.
Hi, I'm Jamila Singleton Munson, and I'm running also for the Zone 4 seat. I am a previous student of Portland Public Schools, a graduate from Grand High School, and I've been a teacher, a principal, and I've also trained and currently work training new teachers. And my interest in coming into this particular seat right now is I've found the current board member who's been sitting in this seat to be someone who throws bombs and creates unproductive dialogue. And I think in a lot of ways, if you click on current meetings that have happened this last week, I have really found it to be challenging and believe that as a board member, you're responsible for all of the perspectives of the students in the community and not just your own perspective. And I originally wanted to challenge Steve Buell, and since then, he has stepped down and will be stepping down, and Rita and I are the last 2 in the race. And I think that it's important to note that I have a lot of respect for everyone, actually, who's on this panel, because I think everyone brings different kinds of experiences. But I'm the only one on this panel who actually has worked in schools with children and has really strived to make sure that they experience success. And I think we need people who are on the board who understand what it means to create an environment where diverse students who come from different backgrounds can succeed, and that informs our decision making in the way that we reconfigure our schools, in the way that we hire principals, in the way that we train our teachers. Students should really be at the center of our decision making, and people need to continue to bring that perspective to the board. And so I we'll continue to talk more today about what I hope to accomplish, but I hope in the next 4 years to be an advocate for equity, and particularly to ensure that our racial equity policy is reinstated and that we're able to move forward with the work in ensuring that we actually achieve our mission of all students really having a quality education in Portland Public Schools.
Can I do a slight correction? And it's not your fault that I'm correcting you, because I really haven't talked about it. I actually teach on the side. I'm an economist, but I teach a course every term at a community college. Most of my kids are high school students. You probably didn't know this about me. And so I know what it's like to have 40 kids in a classroom, and it's not all day, so it's different from a high school experience. but I know what it's like to be handed a book and with a week before school starts and say, invent a class, and to try to how to, go from stand and deliver to techniques that engage students and that and to weave in social justice issues as well. So that's a little tidbit. Nothing compared to your experience. Don't get me wrong.
Right. Thank you very much for your introduction, Jamila, and thank you, Scott, for the correction. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to give you guys about 15 minutes or so. You don't need to use up that whole time. But as we said today and as we promoted this event, there's some hot topics that we really wanted to have these folks speak to, and especially not just in trying to win votes for the school board, but really to try to open up this larger dialogue about the future of Portland Public Schools. And so we're looking at issues such as the middle school implementation plan that was rolled out before the school board a couple of weeks ago. And we want to hear what each of the panelists here today think of that, where they believe it should go. The racial equity policy that the district has adopted, that is, I think probably all folks here would agree it's a very robust policy. But what do we need to do to actually put that policy into action? And accountability and oversight, another issue that was confirmed by an independent investigation into the district's operations. One of the things that led to the unseating of the past superintendent, Carol Smith. And that was identified as a major issue throughout the organization. So I'd love to hear from each of you guys in talking about how these issues, maybe what we can do is well, would you guys prefer to just speak to each of the three, or perhaps we can talk one at a time and hear from each of you on each of the three? I think I'm going to make an executive decision and say that's a better way to go.
I think that would be better.
Yeah. So, and Jamila, I'm gonna, since we introduced from this way over, Jamila, I'm gonna let you begin this time, and we'll work from the left to the right. So if you want to speak to your perspectives on middle school implementation, that
Sure.
would be great. Okay, thank you.
And for those who are watching live, I'm trying to figure out how to get this posted online so that you can see it. I'll figure that out while I'm sitting here as I'm not speaking. But I did a little bit of thinking in advance about where we are with middle school implementation. And I think particularly this over the last couple weeks, there have been some large developments, particularly at the DBRAC meeting that just happened last night. And so I think I'll start with a little bit of context. And when I think about these questions about transitioning away and thinking about how we move into having a new middle school model, as well as what process we would want to put in place, I think about the processes that have already been in place. And I'm going to particularly name the fact that there has been a middle school framework that has just been adopted through the board resolution in April. And the board just had a working session this last week to talk about how to implement that framework. And Chris Russo presented a plan that articulated a process for implementation. And so I'm going to connect that to an issue that I actually think is very tightly bound with our racial equity policy, and it's an issue around our school climate plans. And so when I think about the way that our middle schools are currently being implemented, or there's already been a challenge at Ockley Green. The principal was placed on permanent leave, and there's a lot of conversation in the community that parents felt that the method of discipline was very unstructured and ineffective. And so in my mind, because we have set a goal to decrease exclusionary discipline, and we've made some progress, but we're not there yet. You can see there's still gaps. You know, there's twice as many Black students who experience exclusionary discipline as Hispanic students, and almost over three times the number of Black students who experience exclusionary discipline from white students. And so this is still a big issue. And so when I think about implementing a middle school plan, I think we need to make sure as a board that the middle grade steering committee is really charged with how to implement PBIS and how to ensure that we have restorative practices and that the school climate plans actually address what it means to bring together kids from diverse school communities into these middle schools. And I think we've already seen in Ockley Green that has been a big challenge. I won't speak from personal experience because I don't teach there, I don't have children there, but I'll speak from just what I've read in the media, that has been the narrative. And so I think, in addition, the board needs to reinstate the racial equity policy to make sure that we do focus on this moving forward. And also there needs to be a monitoring and analyzing the way that this discipline is showing up in our middle schools in the Teaching and Learning Committee. And if we look at our Teaching and Learning Committee notes over the past 2 years, that actually has not been a big focus of conversation in that space. And so the last thing that I would say is we also need to ensure that there is a metric that our board puts in place that measures, one, the fidelity of the current workflow implementation timeline plan. I've heard all of those kind of 3 names put in place, so that all 26 departments that have to coordinate are actually monitored by the board to make sure that implementation is effective. And the board is going to have to talk about what fidelity to that will look like and how we're going to benchmark it. Because it's great that the plan's in place, but how do we actually make sure that the plan gets put in practice? And then I think the last piece, but is probably a larger issue, is we have to make sure that parents express satisfaction, and then we have a measure around that. So parents need to feel, and staff need to feel, that they've had an opportunity to be a part of the decision-making process in building these middle schools and making sure that these middle schools are open, and that there is a proper level of communication, and that their perception is that they had an opportunity to be involved in the process in the 2017-18 transition before they open. And so this also includes hiring the principal. This also includes implementing what's happening with these school climate plans and making sure that there's a distributive leadership decision-making process. But I think what I would say to all of this is the framework has been adopted, an implementation plan has been developed, and now it's about engaging the communities as the conversation happens about opening up these next 2 middle schools at Roseway Heights and Harriet Tubman. And I think that we have to do that work with a racial equity lens throughout. And I think the school climate plans give us an opportunity, and it's a key lever that we can use to make sure that there's an inclusive environment that addresses some of the challenges that we've already seen in the Ockley Green implementation. And the last thing that I will add, which was a new development as of last night, so DBRAC had a discussion about addressing the implementation and the timeline in which there needs to be a decision about feeders. And the 2 proposals on the table are that DBRAC needs to help the superintendent make a recommendation to the board about should it be June implementation June decision of selecting these feeder patterns, from what I understood, and Scott could speak to this more because he's on the committee, but or a September decision. And 2 things that stood out to me in this meeting that I think were, one of them came from Jason Trumbulley, who's one of the co-chairs, and something that he said that I thought was really interesting is that, you know, he acknowledged that there have been several listening sessions, and there were also recommendations that the superintendent Smith had already made about how to determine what these feeders should be. It's important that we move forward and help our community not continue to discuss what are we going to do, but how are we going to do this. And I think in my mind, from both what I saw Chris Russo present in the work session about the amount of time it's going to take to create an implementation plan that's effective, and based on what Co-Chair Trumbulley said, I think that making the feeder pattern decision by June is the way that we get to an effective implementation plan. I'm concerned if we wait, particularly because there's no superintendent confirmed for post-June 30th, that if we wait for September, this could actually drag on longer, which will severely impact the effectiveness of implementing the plan that's been put in place and being able to actually have these steering committee conversations and not what are we going to do, what feeders are going into the school, but actually talking about the kids, the community, the cultures that are going to come into the school and spend a year discussing that.
Thank you, Jamila. I did want to make sure that we clarified one point, though, because this has been something that's been a bit of a point of confusion.
Sure.
I think you said something about parents and staff need to feel a part of the decision-making process ahead of the 17-18, but it's 18-19, correct?
I meant during the 17-18
18
transition
year.
window.
Okay,
so this
gotcha.
window that's coming up so that it opens in 18-19.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Jamila. And then another point of
Can
logistics.
I also make a clarification?
Yes.
It's Jamila.
Jamila, thank you. I
Yep.
will never do that again.
It's okay.
Jamila. Just another point of logistics here. So instead of doing the 15 to 20 minutes to give your whole piece, right? We're gonna, I'm gonna let you know when 5 minutes has expired and just ask you to wrap up. So I'll just give you a little signal to let you know, okay? So Rita, go ahead, take it away.
Okay. So I agreed with a lot of what Jamila said, but I think there are a couple things that I disagree with. I think it's important to set the context. We're now talking about going back to a middle school model because in 2005, 2006, under previous superintendent Vicki Phillips, we did this lightning fast transition to K-8s. So instead of K-5 middle school, we went to mostly K-8s on the east side, only on the east side. And they have now been in place for over 10 years. And during that time, most of those K-8s have been under-enrolled. And that's important because kids who have been in under-enrolled K-8s in the middle grades, so 6, 7, and 8, have been denied access to an actual middle school experience. They have not only not received electives, they have been denied access to what even PPS considers to be core curriculum. They have had no electives. There are a number of schools where the electives available to these kids were things like cafeteria assistant, office help. This is not middle school. So these kids have been showing up to high schools, and the principals and the teachers are saying they are unprepared. They are academically unprepared, they are emotionally unprepared, they are socially unprepared. So we're now finally talking about bringing back middle schools, and that's why this is important. We've been waiting for a very long time. We need to do this right. We need to do this now. And it's important because we also know that middle school is the age when we lose kids. Kids start to check out if they're not engaged. So we need to make sure that these middle schools happen and that they happen right. So we now have what PPS is talking about, calling a framework that has been adopted and a plan. A couple of things, there are some good things, there are some not so good things. It's a little troubling to me that we are apparently starting from scratch and developing a vision for what a middle school education is supposed to look like. One would have thought we had that already, but okay. So we're starting to get it now, that's a good thing. The framework is pretty general, it's a framework, and so it's a starting point. And we now have all kinds of, I don't know if you can see, I've got a pile of papers in my hand. And that is what PPS is calling a plan. And, I've been a bureaucrat for a while, and this isn't a plan. This is the beginning of a plan, but it's not a plan. They've divided it up nicely into different categories of issues that they need to talk about. There are a lot of blank spaces. So I'm hoping that in the coming months, teachers are finally engaged in this exercise, because they haven't been so far, and parents and school communities. So I think, my optimistic take on this is that we've got some building blocks that are starting to happen. We need to fill in all the blanks. In terms of implementation, we now have, Ockley Green was opened this year, reopened as a middle school. There have been some issues in the implementation. It happened very quickly. It happened in the space of like 3.5 months. And there have been some issues. But it's important to note that even with the issues, and some of them have been significant, what I am hearing from students and parents in the Ockley school community are that they are thrilled that they finally have a middle school, even with all the problems. They're happy that it opened when it opened. There are some things that we need to do better. First and foremost, a principal. All of the research shows that the quality of the leadership in the building is the primary determinant of pretty much everything that happens in that building. I would think that, well, let me just say this. I think if we're going to have a principal that is going to be opening a middle school, it would be incumbent upon PPS to find somebody who is experienced in running a middle school. That didn't happen this year. I'm hoping that going forward, the principals who are appointed to the new middle schools as they open will be experienced in doing this. Middle school is very complicated. It's particularly complicated. Can I go on for a couple more?
I'm just letting you know it's been 5 minutes.
Okay, and how much do I have altogether?
Jamila got a little bit more than 5, so
Okay.
I think about 8. So.
Okay. Okay, so we need to have good principals, and it kind of speaks to the absence of a system for hiring, assigning, supporting, monitoring principals within PPS, which is a long-standing problem. We need to fix that. We need to make sure that these new middle schools have the resources that they need to have a full curriculum, including not only electives, but also supports. So far, we've been doing it based on enrollment, and that has caused all kinds of problems, which is why we have this whole DBRAC thing going on. I think PPS ought to start looking at finding a different formula for staffing schools. If we can't get the enrollment right, we need to start looking at funding schools by program so that every single student gets access to at least a minimal common program. And one of the things that's troubling to me about this plan that they have developed, they frame it in terms of an exemplary middle school. And I'm not seeing a lot of language around here that clarifies that every school will have X, Y, and Z. And I think that's what we need. We have vast disparities across schools in PPS, vast. We need to have the school district mandating that a particular program, if this is the middle school program that we think all kids should have it, period. And we need to make sure that we have the funding in place to make sure that happens. And the last thing I want to say, I mean, there's lots more to say, but the last thing is we need to be thinking about what's called articulation. So, you know, a kid goes through PPS, kindergarten through 12th grade. Most kids, certainly not all, but at least the district ought to be thinking in terms of creating pathways for students so that you get, in K through 5, you get experiences that you're going to be able to use in middle school. And then the experiences in middle school you'll continue into high school. So things like, if you're going to have, if you're articulating to a high school that has band, then middle school needs to have band. If it has choir, but it doesn't have band, then those kids that come out of that middle school are not going to be able to take advantage of that opportunity in high school. And we have this mismatch all over the place. And PPS needs to start thinking in terms of, you know, providing pathways for students to explore interests and then develop them. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rita. So just given that the first 2 speakers took about 8 minutes, I'm going to change the time to 8 minutes so that it's equitable
I will not
for
take 8
everyone.
minutes, I promise.
Okay. Okay, thank you guys very much. Go ahead, Virginia, whenever you're ready.
I chuckled when you said you come at this, being a bureaucrat for a long time, and we come at it from a very different lens because I work in the private sector. I'm a small business owner, and I've also worked in strategic planning and strategic marketing for many years. So I come at this very tactically, and I think that's great to consider when you're putting a board together, because everybody's going to have a strength and approach a problem in a different way and hopefully solve for the perfect solution. And I sat down and looked at this framework, and the first thing I thought is that this should be a project that's being led by the best of the best. This is not a small project. This is not a project that anyone without any experience handling something like this will be able to do well. So I think we should consider that as we're moving forward. When I read the framework, the first thing I thought, and you touched on this a little bit, Rita, is that it's too broad, even for a framework. And I do have concerns even looking at it. Moving forward right now the way it is. I've built several departments from the ground up, and when I see a plan like this, and I'm not trying to be overly critical, but there are some major problems. The first one is that there really isn't a solid timeline for the steps that are included in the plan. That's the problem. The language is very broad, development of specific tools, what structures, what processes. Assigned planning principles, but it doesn't say what they are. These are things that need to be included in a framework for us to even understand what work needs to be done. So coming at it from, a planning perspective, I would have a very difficult time working with a document like this. I think that, Jamila, I hadn't heard about the June-September thing from last night for, that was to, what was the date for? It was
to determine the feeder patterns.
The feeder patterns. I guess when I heard that, the first thing I was asking myself is, why are we picking June and September? Why are those the timeframes? Because June is definitely, that's when we would want to have it done. But when I look at this framework, I'm not even sure how that's possible with the lack of information. And maybe somebody can clarify that for me. I do believe in exactly what Rita said as well, that we need an equitable curriculum across every school. And if we can't get the enrollment issues right, we need to start looking at funding by program, because it shouldn't matter what school you go to. You should have access to the exact same curriculum at every school. And one area where I'm particularly passionate about that actually is the arts. As a parent, I find it concerning that my child's access to something like band or choir would be determined by what zip code I live in. I think that every child should have access to those. Those are the subject matter that often keeps children in school that may be struggling. In addition, there are groups that, like the Constitution team. We don't have that at every single school. That's something I would want for my child, but it's going to depend on where I live. As a parent, that makes me angry, to be totally honest with you. I want every child in this district to have access to the same programming, especially when it comes to electives, because that's really, when you get into middle school and high school, what's going to determine the trajectory of your life. So it's not just the core curriculum. It's actually everything else that you lay on top of it. It's just as important. And as a district, we need to figure out how to make that work for every school. And there is definitely a sense of urgency around it. This process has taken too long.
Sorry, thank you, Virginia. You really did keep it under 8. Okay. And Scott, hopefully you'll be able to maybe speak as a member of DBRAC to some of that.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
So a little bit of history. In 2012, 2013, Portland Public Schools was doing a number on the Jefferson cluster, which it has been doing for a couple of decades. Particularly, they were doing a process that was supposed to rebalance and redraw boundary lines for schools, because King had too small of a catchment area to have a full student body, but it turned into a school closure exercise. As that thing wrapped up, I was going to all those meetings and was appalled. And at all the public testimony, people were just lined up screaming for 3 minutes. Not screaming, but were very critical of what the district was doing. I pulled together a team of teachers and parents, and we wrote a counterproposal. 7 of our recommendations were picked up by Superintendent Smith, forwarded to the board, and adopted by the board as policy. One of those was to fix the transfer system that had been called, rightfully so, racist for years, and that had been hanging around for years. Finally, we got a lot of that work done. through SACIT, the Superintendent's Advisory Committee on Enrollment and Transfer. And another one of our recommendations was to do district-wide rebalancing, which is now happening under the DBRAC, the District-Wide Boundary, oh my God, Advisory Committee. Sorry, the lingo gets to you after a while. And I've been involved in both those committees. Those are taking on huge equity issues in PPS. So I want to counterbalance what DBRAC found out very suddenly out of the blue from the superintendent was this request to figure out the feeder pattern for Tubman and for Roseway Heights like now. And we understand perfectly the urgency for doing that in terms of this planning process. The sooner you know the schools, the sooner you can work with the particular schools and teachers and principals and start to think about aligning programs and that whole transition. On the other hand, and this was why we pushed, and we were just channeling what people in the Jefferson cluster were saying over and over again, district-wide rebalancing is really important because if you do part of the district, it affects the rest of the district and there's constraints. So if you just do those two feeder patterns along with what's already there for Ockley Green, it affects the whole rest of the east side and what you can and can't do. And that's very problematic. And just about every person on DBRAC debriefing after that discussion with the superintendent was very concerned about that. So we're pretty upset because we could have been working on this for the last 6 months, but we were told to wait, hold off, we're not going to meet for a couple of months. It's been very frustrating. Sigh. Okay, and the whole middle school discussion is happening because that came out of also the DBRAC discussion. And when that was dumped on us because it wasn't our original mission, we said, oh, well, if you're not going to make the decision, we'll make the decision. And we did. And we did it for equity reasons that have been well enunciated by other panel members here. But off the get-go, another parent and I on DBRAC, Michelle Arntz, very early said, wait, you want to transition to middle schools. What are those middle schools going to look like? What's your plan? And became apparent right then, this was 2 years ago, that there was no plan. Even though we've been doing middle schools for a long time, there was no plan. And it's taken this long to come up with something that, again, we've got pages and pages, and the latest version does have a timeline and some budget attached, but it is still very much a plan in progress. There doesn't seem to be a clear process for why weren't teachers engaged from the get-go, which I think if you're running, one of my hallmark values is collaboration. You get the stakeholders on the front end of it so that we have all points of view, and then you figure out a good process from there. And we don't have that yet. There's still time, I think, to work that through, but that was a mistake off the get-go. In terms of what's there, I mean, there's a ton of stuff there, but I want to take a step back from that and say, great schools are communities. And so how we're creating new communities in these middle schools. How do we go about doing that? And any plan that comes about that has to pay attention to the human factor in that. And those communities are bringing teachers together. They're bringing students together. So how do we anticipate that? So next year's fifth graders, what are we doing to very early on connect them with that middle school? Connect them with maybe seventh graders that year who are going to be eighth graders when they hit the middle school, so they start to have some personal connections with student leaders. We could do tons of kind of cool stuff, bringing kids on to get them excited, and also bringing in their high school that they'll be feeding to as part of that. Because schools are not just islands, they're in a context. So creating that community, I think, is a really important part. And that speaks to the implementation of the school on day one. What went wrong in Ockley Green and is not going right in other schools where discipline is an issue is setting the tone from day one of what are our community values, what are our expectations, and having the systems in place and the knowledge in place and the agreements with staff and the principal of when kids do get out of line, how are we going to turn that into a learning opportunity and not a punitive opportunity. And if you approach kids along those lines, I think you see results. And I think we're seeing things, I think, change. I'm hurrying a little bit at Ockley Green because that's what's starting to happen now. And you're shaking your head, so I'm taking
Yes,
that
although
as
I'm trying to remain neutral in this conversation.
and
Yes.
I don't take that as that's not on me. This is people doing what needed to be done in Portland Public Schools. The middle school thing ties in with our other two topics because, as has been said, if you don't have the right principal there, that school's not going to work very well. And Portland Public has a long-standing issue with being very uneven around principal quality and doing anything about that. So I think the hiring of that principal should be done with not only central office staff, but with parent representatives and staff representatives. And we've done that before. Back in 2001, I pushed through a policy change in how principals would be hired, which would include the school community in that hiring process. And for the first 5 years, the actual practice of that was that there would be hiring committees of the school community along with HR to make sure that we're asking legal questions and their interests are represented. And that worked really well. And then somebody new came in HR and without announcing it, changed the practice. That's a problem with Portland Public Schools. And so one of my themes of my candidacy is we need to fix management. And that's one of those management practices that really kills us. And that ties in with accountability and how we evaluate principals, for example. Again, the school community should be part of that evaluation process. So all those themes are intertied. As a board member, it's not my job to design this implementation process. It is my job to make sure that it's done well with educational expertise and in a collaborative manner. And it's my job not just to listen to central office staff say things are going great, but also to engage at the ground level to hear from teachers and parents and school staff that they too are engaged. And it's not just teachers that should be involved. That school secretary is huge. The custodial staff, the paraeducators, the educational assistants, and so on need to be involved in that. They are part of creating that community, and that's what great schools are all about. And there's more to say, but that's enough for now.
Thank you very much, Scott.
All right. So I didn't realize that our intro was going to be more than just saying our one little nugget about why we were running, and everybody got a little bit more of a background. And I want to bring up a couple of points in particular that I think are relevant here, and I'll bring in some other things maybe later. But first of all, I want to say that I come from a family of public educators. Both my parents were teachers. My brother is a teacher. My mom was a union president. I understand what it means for our teaching staff and our educational staff broadly to sacrifice day in and day out to be continued to be expected to do more with less. And I recognize that thank you for doing the work. Thank you for doing this, but this should be part of our workday. We should be having this kind of conversation as part of your job, because it is your job, because the teaching staff should be running this. So I understand, I have said at many dinner tables hearing about how teachers who want to do more don't feel empowered or don't feel safe to do more. And I don't want that culture in PPS. So I feel like that's really, really important. Also, I do want to clarify, I also am was never a K through 12 educator, but I am a seasoned classroom educator, and I have taught for many years at the university level, and also mentored undergraduates and high school students, including young women of color in STEM fields. So I have a lot of experience working with youth all the way up through professional education in a diversity of fields. Again, not K-12 education, but related. Okay, so middle schools. I want to definitely reiterate a number of criticisms and points that have been brought up here already, and I don't want to like overly dwell on them. I definitely agree that this plan is not what I would want a plan like this to be at an age of a program and conversation that we're at right now. This is watered down buzzwords with no defined timeline, no real well laid out criteria for evaluation, even at this early of a stage. And this was set up 2.5 years ago, right? Like, institutional slow churn is real and has real and significant impacts on the lives of students who only spend 3 years in 6, 7, 8, right? Like, we're missing generations as they pass through. This is really, really important. Every wasted day where we don't have education being provided that will actually keep students in school, engaged and learning, and progress them through their educational trajectory to be able to become whatever they want to be in life is a day that we should be upset with what we did, right? And so I understand that PPS is a large organization. There are lots of thousands of students and there are thousands of employees. But what this plan represents to me, I think, is very reflective of a dysfunctional organization at the organizational level. It's not for the sake of the teachers or the staff, but for the oversight board, what we're all trying to be on, and the central administration staff, right? And I think this plan in particular highlights a lot of that issue in terms of its generality, its vagueness, its inability to actually put together a plan that can be actioned by folks that need to do it, fails to have buy-in from the community that's being affected in any sort of way, and fails to be driven by data. I'm a data person. I have a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. I do data science professionally. I think about spatial maps all the time. Like, I do mapping stuff. There are data that exist that we should be using to decide where we're drawing these boundary lines, right? There is really good quantitative information about where populations are growing and what racial makeups and economic makeups exist where. Why are we not leveraging that immense amount of data to drive this discussion, working with community partners? Like, why are we not doing this? Because we fail to have administrative staff delegating the appropriate task. We delegate a very general, very poorly thought out in terms of specifics task to administrative staff that don't have the support necessary to actually develop a plan. That's an administrative organizational failure. That's a problem. Take a breath for a second. I don't know. Institutional structure things are really they're hard because you look at them and you see them and it feels so immense. And in this particular situation, we're talking about like the real lived experiences of children in schools, and this is important, right? Like, so we can't just oh gosh, it takes a while. Like, every single board meeting that more isn't being done is a waste of time, because this is how you burn out people, right? Like, this is how the system at work burns out those of us who are in this room. We want to make change, we're trying to make change, and we can't, right? So. Some specific stuff in here that I think is really, really important and relates to how this does completely, I appreciate you separating these so we can focus on them, but it does completely tie in to both accountability, as I've just been sort of talking about. That's an issue of accountability, of us doing our job as administrators and an oversight staff, but then also racial equity and equity in general. So for a plan like this, to not front and center talk about like the issues of schools that would be transitioning into middle school systems is a problem. I'm talking about issues like exclusionary discipline and ELL students, right? Like, those are real, serious issues that are significant in impacting staffing needs for any school. And specifically, when we have an opportunity for setting up a new school situation, for us not to be centering the needs of students who are marginalized right now is a huge problem, right? Like, where's the centering of disabled students in here, right? Like, where is the need for students who are graduating at 2/3 of the overall rate, right? The overall rate is 74%. Disabled students on IEPs graduate at 49%, right? Like, if we're not talking about them here, we're losing them. As was brought up before, these are formative years. These are years when individuals are becoming themselves, becoming part of a community, feeling who they are, and learning things that will carry them on to the rest of their lives. And if they show up and don't have the support systems that they need, they're not going to get that, right? If they don't have the wraparound programs, if they don't have the diverse schedule, if they don't have the teachers that look like them, if they don't have the administrator who supports them, if they don't actually have staff members in the building who focus on restorative justice as a primary job, they won't actually be able to get restorative justice, and they're more likely to end up in handcuffs. They're more likely to end up arrested, and they're more likely to end up in the prison to school to prison pipeline. And that's real, and we need to talk about that. Like, we cannot set up situations where we have young boys, young women, young men, young women, young girls, young boys, whatever. However we want to talk about folks that are in 6th to 8th grade who are dealing with lots in their lives, right? This is a crucial moment where we need to be addressing behavioral issues and how we as a community work through trauma, individual trauma and community trauma. Like, we need to be having these conversations. This is a fantastic opportunity for us to focus our racial equity lens, and we're not doing it. We're failing at that. And I think that's really, really important to call out here. And especially in Zone 6, where there is a very large community of students and family members who do not speak English as a primary language, I am so concerned about how we support our family members in our middle school implementation and how we actually engage the communities that are being impacted by the middle school implementation plan. If they, because they speak another language, don't have access to an appropriately translated document that explains what is happening, they won't feel actually invested. And that's a huge problem. That is a huge, huge problem in terms of accessibility. Oh, my time. Okay, cool.
Can I say one thing? I just want
Yes.
to say, you're absolutely right. When you look at this, it's missing one thing, students.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not in here.
There's students on the cover.
There's a picture. There's a stock photo.
Just saying.
So can I say a few words in PPS defense?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll give you 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. Absolutely, this framework is, well, it's been said. There is the next level down that has come out in the last couple of weeks, and it does include a huge amount of pages and details. It does call out restorative justice, for example, PBIS, and a lot of things that should be called out. There's a bunch of howevers, but I'll just, and there is a timeline as well. There's a bunch of howevers, but I'll just say, leave it there, and we can go on.
Okay, so, sorry, I need my mic on. Okay, so thank you all for speaking to the issue of middle school implementation. Next, we're going to move on, and let's see. I kind of want to switch it up, you know, like as a teacher, like randomize a little bit. So I think what we'll do here is we're going to start with Virginia, and then we'll work our way out. Oh, that's my duck timer. So we'll start with Virginia. We're going to move on to the racial equity policy and where you stand on that. And so we'll go Virginia, and then Scott, and then Rita, and then Josie, and then Jamila. Okay? All right, so let's try to keep to 5 minutes just in the interest of time. I know there's a lot to unpack here. It's okay if you go over, but let's try to keep it to 5, and I'll do my best to give you a 1 minute signal, okay?
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Okay, so as far as we talk a lot about the racial equity policy at all of the forums that we've had, and clearly it's a critical component of how PPS, should view any any project or goal, as a district, this has to be part of it. Over half of our kindergarten students are children of color now. And one of the specific questions you asked in the information that you sent out, it was how can the board better facilitate the recruitment, hiring, and retention of more teachers of color into the PPS system? It's also a question I've received more than a few times throughout this campaign, and something we do need to focus on immediately. There's data coming out now that actually shows that the more reflective a teaching staff is of its student body, the higher the retention rate of those students is. We have some work to do there immediately. We are losing, not losing, that's not the right word. There are teachers retiring, and as we start to recruit new teachers, we need to have some sort of framework in place for how we hire and what those goals are. Like, what percentage of our teaching staff do we want to have as teachers of color? That's an important question, and we have to have that goal in place in order to execute it. Retention of teachers of color is an issue as well, and we go back to the issue of great principals, not good principals, great principals, and how we make that happen. We have seen principal churn at schools that are struggling over and over again. We need to ask ourselves, I don't know if anybody sitting here can actually answer the question of exactly why that is happening. We need to figure out why that's happening. There's some mechanism missing, and I always look at things like that through an accountability lens, which you mentioned the Stolburn report earlier, and I'll talk about that more in our next question. But there is no accountability process in PPS, and it's really hard to believe when you're coming in from the outside. Staff members don't even get reviews. They might be 3 years. I always say, can you imagine being in a job where you didn't get an employee review for 3 years? I would feel like somebody didn't care about the work I was doing. And when you do a review process, when you work outside of a bureaucracy in the private sector, you learn that those processes have evolved a lot in the last 10 years. It's not a top-down format when you have an employee review. It's a 360-degree format. Especially the principal, is the perfect position for something like this, which is why I always bring it up at this point. The principal is a person who is communicating with parents, with students, with teachers, with the central office. There's a lot coming at that person. So in terms of a review process, I would want to know what all of those stakeholders think about this individual that's doing this job. And it's not to throw anybody under the bus. It's to find opportunities for professional development for that person. It's to figure out what they're doing really well and maybe pull them in to mentor somebody else at another school. It's to find out if there's a pattern of, for a specific problem. If you have 8 teachers that are saying the same thing about one person and it's problematic, there's probably an issue that needs to be addressed with the principal. It's really easy to figure out. There's systems in place like this at most places of business, and I would like to see that those principles be applied at PPS at every level. Teachers, principals, central office, superintendent. It's a no-brainer for me, and it has to be in place in order for something like the racial equity policy to be successful. It can't be successful without a process in place like that. So I'm a little all over the place, but again, the question was initial question was about hiring and retention of teachers of color, and we can't keep teachers if we don't know what's driving them out. And so as far as racial equity in the classroom goes, I feel very strongly in increased investments in K through 3 reading and literacy. If you can't read, you can't learn, and we need to have more assessments in the classroom along the way. Assessments and tests are 2 different things. Assessment shows us student growth. So a student being assessed at the beginning of a unit and at the end of a unit shows us how much that particular student has learned and offers the opportunity for intervention throughout the year. That's really important because at the end of the year, we do need to have some sort of way to measure whether or not that student is meeting grade level benchmarks. And that's a conversation that's come up with teachers as well as SBAC is very controversial. I am not a fan, but I've talked to more than a few teachers in the last couple weeks about their feelings about, do you just get rid of it or do you replace it? And the answer is always replacing it, but replacing it with what? Because we do need to make sure that our students are meeting their goals before we move them on to the next grade. You were waving me. Am I out of time?
No, you had a minute.
Okay.
30 seconds.
So that's fine. I think I covered my main points.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you, Virginia. So now we'll go to Scott.
Okay, so you can go to the district website and download the equity policy, which is fine as it's still in place, but there's also a 5-year plan which expired in 2016. If you look at that 5-year plan and read it real quick, it's only a couple of pages, it's not a plan. And that summarizes PPS. They put out something that's actually kind of a values statement, but it's not a plan of how do we get here? How do we implement these things?
But it's version 3.31.14.
Yeah, exactly. So, and, to talk about to build on what Virginia talked about, a culturally responsive workforce, if you have an HR department that is a nightmare, that is incredibly poorly managed, and we've known that for years. I mean, in 2011, there was an audit that never got publicized that somebody came in and looked at it and said, wow, there are no systems here. You guys are all nice people, but you're not talking to each other. You're not working together. We know that there have been really good, competent people apply for jobs at PPS and they never hear back from the district. We know that there have been some really poor hires along the way. And so if you're a teacher of color and you do get recruited and you go to work for PPS and your principal is a nightmare, you're out of there. I mean, you're like Beaverton, Vancouver, somewhere. I'm out of here. And that's happened time and again. So cleaning up that central office is really, before we can actually implement a policy and a plan, we have to have a well-functioning HR department. And I think in the interim, we should borrow some executives from some private sector firms that know how to do it to help us build those systems. Another point in the quote plan is culturally responsive family and community engagement. Well, if you look at the middle school gory details, I've got the black and white version. Rita's got the pretty colored one. The family engagement stuff is in green, correct? Which means it is optional. This has been PPS's issue with family engagement for as long as I've been around, 20 years, that family engagement is not valued by the administration. So all through the last decade, 2001 to 2011, I worked every year to produce a parent leadership conference. They were called the most diverse parent gatherings ever in Portland. We'd have 150 plus parents. The last one we did, 40% of the parents that attended were not native English speakers, for example. We had great workshops. PPS helped on it, but we couldn't get them to really engage and adopt this as a practice. In 2007, I led an assessment of parent engagement across the district. We had 1,100 surveys from parents. We did 20 different focus groups in 5 different languages, so we got breadth and depth to make sure we heard from parents. So parents told us, 1 out of 5 parents said, I don't feel welcome in my child's school. On communication, they said, well, if you speak English, through about 3rd grade, it's pretty good. And then it tapers off and it disappears in high school. When it comes to, do you know what to do at home to help your child succeed? Well, they tell us to read to our kids, and that's about it. So looping back into the middle school program, what would happen if we took parent engagement seriously? Now, every curriculum that PPS adopts is supposed to have a parent engagement component. So imagine as a parent, you get whatever communication works for you, and that should be step 1 of the school. Within the first month of school, of these middle schools opening up, there should be a positive contact from the school to the parent. And it's, hey, I'm Chris, I'm your child's, I don't know what you teach, language arts teacher, and your child did this in class this week, and it was really great. Start it off there, establish communication. And imagine that through whatever communication and language works for you, you get 3 questions a week of things to ask your kid about what's going on in school. Hey, I hear you're studying the Russian Revolution. Tell me about it. At the dinner table. And yeah, your kid's going to push back on that. But you work it. You work it. It becomes part of your family culture. Even if you have 2 jobs and can't go to school, you can get that communication. You can do that at home. And the other really important skill in middle grades, where kids are starting to take responsibility for their own education, is time management. And that's something that both school and family can work together to teach. You've got a report due in 3 weeks. What do you want done at the end of the first week? Okay, I'll check back with you then. You give them responsibility. You check in after that first week. If they're on task, show me where you are. Oh yeah, you got all your, you got a bunch of research done. Good. Then I'm out of your face. If you're not on task, the video games or whatnot go away. You're getting it done. You're not doing anything else are on task. That's a partnership that works together that teaches kids those time management skills until they pick them up on their own. And so that's the kind of engagement we could have, again, across languages, across cultures. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, Rita, racial equity policy.
Okay. So the racial educational equity policy was passed in 2011. It's now 2017. We had an implementation plan that wasn't really a plan. It was a statement of principles. It was "we believe" kind of statements. And I'm going to give PPS a little credit here, maybe even a lot of credit. I think we should all be proud of the fact that PPS has a policy. We were one of the first in the country to do it. It is now a model for other districts in the country. It is a good policy. It is thorough. It is comprehensive. It kind of lays out the factors that drive inequities. The difficulty is, like many of the policies in PPS, it has not been implemented well. And I say that because even though we talk endlessly about equity, it is front and center in every discussion, as I think it should be. When you actually look at student outcomes, educational outcomes in PPS are still driven, the best predictor of a student's educational outcome is still race in PPS. We are an outlier in the country. Most school districts in the country, the best predictor of educational outcomes is socioeconomic status, mostly family income. In PPS, nationally, it used to be race, but it's now been overtaken by economic factors. In PPS, however, race continues to be the best predictor. And this is even after we passed a policy and we've been trying to implement stuff. So I gotta wonder, what are we doing that isn't working? I think we have made some progress. Graduation rates have improved for kids of color. There have been some spectacular successes. Jefferson High School, the graduation rate is now, I think, 88%. I mean, there are some spectacular examples of real progress. But we have so much further to go. And I think we need to really look at how we are approaching the equity work to make sure that we're being as effective as we can possibly be. So let me just give a couple of examples. Exclusionary discipline. 4 years ago now, the then Superintendent Carol Smith declared that we were going to cut exclusionary discipline by 50% overall, and we were going to cut the disparities in exclusionary discipline by 50%. Exclusionary discipline meaning suspension and exclusion and expulsion. If you look at the numbers, we did in fact cut the overall exclusionary discipline rate by 50%. We did not, however, cut the disparity has not budged. So we are overall decreasing exclusionary discipline, but the disparities, the kids who are most affected by exclusionary discipline, continue to be kids of color, primarily African American kids and Native American kids, especially males. And if you actually look at the data, the trend lines were already going down 4 years ago. So the question I have is, these decreases in exclusionary discipline, have they happened because of what we've done, or were they happening already anyway? I don't know. Okay. We need to have better data. We need to have more evaluation about what we're doing and what kind of actual impact it's having in the classroom. And I have to say this other thing. In the midst of this emphasis on equity, PPS continued to allow under-enrolled K-8 students to be denied educational opportunities for a decade. Policies are great. Policies are important. But what matters to students is what you actually do. And what PPS has done is to allow institutionalized inequities to persist for over a decade without doing anything about it until parents revolted. We need to do much better by our kids.
Thank you, Rita. Next, we're going to go to Josie.
Awesome. So I think it's really important, and a number of good points have been raised already, and it is important to call out that, yes, this plan was written in 2011, and it was ahead of its time, which is saying something about where America is and where Portland is. But that's still 6 years old, and there's a lot that we've learned about ourselves and a lot that we will continue to learn about ourselves, and we need policies and practices that reflect that. And so I think it is really important that we continue to treat this as a living document and not wait 5 years, not wait 10 years, but to think about policy and practice together as a continuously constant active dialogue. And I think that's really, really important. I really want to call out a couple of things that have been a little bit, so one thing that's been kind of an issue that I don't think everybody quite understands, that equity doesn't mean equal access. It means equal outcomes, right? So I don't want every student within the district to get equal access to everything. I want students who are marginalized and underserved right now to get extra access to things. And we need to acknowledge that and call that out. The district is doing that to some degree already. Schools with lower graduation rates, high schools with lower graduation rates, have higher ratios of FTEs to students, or lower student to FTEs. They have more people there. It's not enough. It's not enough. And that's a reflection of the way the equity policy gets turned into practice through just the small slice of the budget. And something that I will do, whether or not I'm on this board, is to continue to push this district to take an equity approach to their entire budget, not to a slice of the budget. Because what's happening is each one of these schools is getting an extra FTE or two. And then that principal is put in a horrible middle management position of having a diverse set of students with a diverse set of needs that can't be covered with that FTE or two. Now having to decide how to split that up amongst full-time positions or part-time positions, and which community that really needs it is going to get served better or the other. And that's like, we can't do that. We can't put those principals in the middle there and expect them to be able to make decisions that are good for anybody, that are going to make anybody happy. I've been a middle manager before. I don't want to be a middle manager ever again in my life, because I had a manager that micromanaged me and told me how to do things in a way that I knew wasn't productive, right? Like, we have to work as an organization and an institution to embolden and empower all of our staff, including our principals, including our educational staff, including our central administration staff, to be able to really imbue and engage the community with these equity principles and concepts that we talk about a lot. I think it's really important that we build quantitative metrics more explicitly into the policy plan and practice going forward. Actionable steps are really, really, really important. We need to be able to hold ourselves to them. That speaks to the accountability issue. If we don't put in actionable metrics, right, like we're not going to be able to hold ourselves accountable. We'll be able to pat ourselves on the back and wait 5 years while we still continue to address issues. I'm not interested in closing the gap. I'm interested in the gap not existing anymore, right? Like we need to stop talking about closing the gap. If we address the racist and colonial history of Portland and the state of Oregon, we need to own up to the fact that we've been closing the gap really slowly for hundreds of years. The gap should be closed already. We need to address that now. We can't make a little plan, concede a little bit further, and then pat ourselves in the back in 5 years. We're losing generations and it's a problem and we need to fix it now. Hiring staff is a really important thing. I'm really glad this question got brought up in here because it is really, really important here. I want to call out specifically the number that Virginia spoke to earlier. So persistently low-income black boys with a black teacher in 3rd through 5th grade have a 29% increase in interest in college and a 39% decrease in the dropout rate. A 39% decrease in the dropout rate by having one teacher who looks like them in 3rd through 5th grade, right? Like, that is huge. This needs to be front and center. We need a teaching staff that is not only racially diverse, we need them to be diverse in a lot of other ways, right? Like, I have talked to so many queer students and LGBT students within PPS who see nobody that looks like them, who see no safety in school because they don't have administrators or teachers that support them whatsoever. This is really important, and it's really important with regards to race, but it is a much bigger issue, and it intersects across all aspects of identity and all aspects of access, and that's really, really important. And just to bring it back in here, I really want to agree with Scott that there is a lack of capacity in the central office in the district with regards to hiring. And we need to address that problem. The district is continuing to cut staff in the central office, so this will continue to be a problem. I agree that there is an issue and we need to support it with resources. However, we should not be contracting that out. We should be building internal capacity. We should not be hiring somebody for a short amount of time. We should be building internal capacity within our district, because look what happened. We just hired a new superintendent through an external search firm. They did us really well with all that money that we paid them. We don't have any institutional support built off of that as a result, except a sting on the hand, right? Like, we got stung with that, and we don't have that money anymore. And it would have been really great to use that money to support somebody internally to PPS in hiring diverse faculty, diverse teachers, diverse administrators. It'd be really great if we had a position that could focus on that. And I would rather see that be supported instead of supporting an external firm that will again fail us and not be accountable and then leave us not accountable.
Thank you so much, Josie. And last but certainly not least, Jamila.
Yep. Thank you. You got it, Chris. Thanks. So this question, I think, is a very personal question to me. As a person of color, woman of color who went into the teaching profession, my personal context is I did not go into the university to become a teacher. I did not go into the university to become a teacher because I felt like the university reflected the same institution that I actually thought needed to change and be disrupted. And so I saw the same kind of institutionalized racism at the University of Oregon in the School of Education that I saw in our classrooms in the high school, at Grant High School. And so when Teach for America came along and recognized my passion to be a disruptive leader and was willing to give me the opportunity, I stepped into the classroom. And I don't think I would have become a teacher otherwise, because I think that personally at 22 years old, I believe that change came through action, and I didn't think that I was going to be able to take the kind of action that I thought needed to really change our system if I just became a teacher through our traditional routes. And so I start there because this question is about what does it take for us to facilitate the recruitment and hiring and retention of a diverse workforce that support student growth, performance. And one thing that is really troubling to me is as I listen to folks who are beside me, I think one, I've heard about systems, I've heard about parents, I've heard about testing, better data. That is not going to affect the way that we recruit, retain, and hire and train our teachers. And I think that the racial equity policy clearly articulates that this is an initiative that we need to be investing in, and there is currently no plan for that. Like I searched, I looked through the different documents, and there doesn't really seem to be a conversation about it. I don't know if it's the audit committee that should be looking into it or the teaching and learning committee that should be looking into it, but the board is not talking about this part of the policy. And that is in my mind, when I think about what is happening here, we don't have that up there, but the issue right now is teachers of color, the population has increased from 15 to 18% over the past 5 years. We've seen a 2% decrease in the past 5 years in Black teachers, and we've seen a 1% decrease. And that is not at all what we would perceive to be success in the recruitment or retention of a diverse workforce. So I just feel like when we are talking about these problems, we need to be specific. We need to talk about the specific and focus on the specific point of data that we're talking about, and we're talking about teachers of color. And so when the racial equity plan was updated this April, or there was an update that was given to the board, there was a report on how things had gone, but there wasn't a lot of articulation about what had been done to get to this point. And so while I agree with you, we have issues with staffing and HR, I would be interested in a board that actually has some ideas and has a vision for what to do about it and has some solutions for what to do about it. And so I think that it's time that we propose a resolution. And if I were on the board, I would want to propose a resolution to initiate a steering committee that includes members of the PAT, includes the district human resources members, includes teaching and learning committee or teaching and learning department members and regional directors, and charges them with analyzing what has been going on with the recruitment and retention of employees within the district. Let's not just talk about teachers, right? Like, we're losing principals, assistant principals, classified staff, people are just like falling through the net. And so I think that we need to figure out what is our talent strategy from here. And I don't think that there's been enough focus on that. And being someone who works in an organization where people are the key it is the people that make the change. I can't imagine that we will ever get to where we want to go in PPS if we don't have the right people on the bus. It's just not going to happen. So in my mind, that's one of our top priorities and something that the board really needs to think about. And not just any people, right? But very diverse and culturally competent people. Because even if we are not talking about teachers of color and we're talking about white teachers or white employees, they need to be culturally competent still, because they're going to deal with a student population that is increasingly diverse, 40% students of color now. And so those are the kinds of people we need to hire. And I'm really curious right now why this is not something that the board is having more conversations about. I know that there are big health and safety hazards and budget issues, but this to me is also pretty critical, having the right people in the seats. And the last thing that I would say is I also think personally, while I work at Teach for America, and Teach for America has 50% people of color who are now in the organization who go into the teaching field, which is about 10 times the national average. I know that is not a solution for the city. Teach for America is not a viable issue or not a viable solution. It's not something that people are supportive of here. And so instead, we need to figure out how to leverage programs that are here locally that our district partners with. And so I personally would want to advocate to engage with universities and other teacher preparation programs and possibly put together a task force. And a lot of people talk about advocating for funding. I want to advocate for better teacher preparation. And I think we have a lot of people who do the advocacy around funding. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but I really believe we need to have advocates who can continue to develop and strategy about how to improve the workforce that's coming into our education system. So that's what's on my mind for the most part when we talk about some of the failures that we've seen in recruiting and this current data that's shown a decline and not an increase. And I just want to thank Josie actually because your data that you just pointed to validated the fact that people like me matter in the system. And I think that right now this data is showing us that people like me don't feel like they matter and they're leaving. And I think it's important that we call out that when there are more diverse folks in our school system, kids do better.
Thank you, Jamila. I'm going to turn it back over to Karanja here to take a couple of relevant questions from the audience.
All right, we have a couple questions relating to this particular topic. So, in the racial equity policy, it states that the district shall welcome and empower students and families. So the key word is empower, including underrepresented families of color as an essential partner in students' education, school planning, and district decision making. So we have a couple of questions that ties into that. Do you want to stand right here and ask this question?
What does that look like to you as a board member? And how will you include students and families in the district decision-making of a new superintendent?
So anybody can take that.
Maybe for the sake of process, we'll just go.
Yeah.
We'll just go Josie on down.
Cool. So at one of the other forums, there was a question asked to us about whether we supported taking the school board on the road. And I think that's the sort of one of many, many, many major steps that needs to happen. I don't believe an open door means we've done our job. That's not how you empower people. Having a school board where we have limited access and limited opportunity and conversation between the school board and the community members sets up a situation where voices that are marginalized aren't going to be heard. And so what we have to do in order to empower those communities is actually get to them and go to them. And that's on us as a school board to do that. And I think that's really, really important. And moving the school board around, I think, does some of addressing that. But there needs to be a lot more direct and open conversation between community members and the school board so that those 7 of us who are on the board can actually do their job and represent the entire community.
So one of the, we're going to get to accountability in a minute. Every school is supposed to have a site council. That is supposed to be a committee that has the principal and teachers and staff and parents and students. Actually, students aren't there by law, but they should be. And when I was on site councils at the middle school and high school level, at high school we had student representatives. And they really drove at Grant, when Grant was starting to look at achievement issues. The kids were the ones that did the data digging and pushed the community to say, hey, we have a real issue here and around disparities in suspension expulsion. So but not all schools have site councils, even though they're mandated by law. Why not? And why shouldn't we have students on each one of those? I already talked about when we hire a principal, students should be engaged in that, part of that hiring panel. They ask great questions. Same with principal evaluation. So there's a whole, those are just examples, but those are ways that we should be empowering students. I was very happy to be, I'm going to be hooking up with the Asia's leadership class at BEH. That's the kind of thing that school board members should be in classrooms, engaging in students, building that leadership, helping them to reflect on and getting feedback on what's happening in your school, what's working for you, what isn't working. that should be part of our communications plan for connecting with the community.
So as a board, do you guys have the power to create a policy that can be able to be implemented for something like that to happen?
Yes.
But here's the accountability issue. The board has great policies. They rarely, if ever, evaluate them and say, how are we doing? So it's state law and policy to have a site council in every school with elected parent reps. Has the board ever seen a report on that? No. Do we know there are schools without site councils? Yes. And multiply that.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing you guys' plan on the oversight and accountability, because we currently do not have any type of accountability. So I'm looking forward to hearing your plans on that.
So I have the question as how do we include communities of color in the hiring process for the superintendent? Is that okay? That's a great question. I believe that in order to engage students and teachers in the process, and they should be part of the process, that we need to have some sort of steering committee that works with the community across the district to find out what you're looking for in a superintendent. That's not something as a board member I would tell you what I think you should. I think that it's a great opportunity for you to provide some direction as we go into the hiring process of what you're looking for in a leader. So that's how I would answer that question.
Let me do a broader thing first. I mean, I think there are a lot of really specific policies and plans and processes that we can come up with. But this is kind of where I land. We've got great policies already on the books. We just don't do them. And we don't do them because we don't want to do them. I think from where I sit, having been in the trenches for 15 years, spending many hours being angry about many things, we need to change the culture of PPS. PPS does not value students' voices, doesn't value parent voices, doesn't value school community voices. We have process paloozas all over the place but it's all window dressing. It's not really authentic communication. When somebody comes up and says, I have a problem at my school, they are stonewalled routinely for months, often years.
What?
Yeah, exactly. This is normal. This is standard operating procedure at PPS. We've got an ombudsperson. We've got complaint policies. We've got grievances. It doesn't matter. None of it matters if people in the central headquarters building don't think it matters. If they don't feel like they have to take these things seriously, they won't, and they don't. So I think one of the first things that this new board needs to say loud and clear is we are going to have a culture change, and we're going to hire a superintendent. I would like to hire a superintendent who has some actual experience in changing an organizational culture. This is not an easy thing to do. One of the things that has struck me over the last 15 years is how many board members have we had over the last 15 years? And even before then, how many superintendents have we had in the last 20 years? And the same kinds of cultural issues, organizational culture, and structural dysfunction, management chaos, it just replicates itself year after year after. It doesn't matter who's in charge, because nobody has tackled the essential problem. We have an organizational culture that doesn't work for anyone. It doesn't work for it doesn't even work for the people who are running this place. Walk into the central office. You have never seen a larger group of miserable people in your life. Everyone is unhappy. PPS doesn't work for anybody. We need to change that. And it comes from the top. And I think if we can start tackling that, then we can start using the policies we've already got.
My turn? Yeah, I've got the last one. Well, I am not going to talk pragmatic. I'm going to get a little more philosophical. So I agree that there is an essential problem, and it's the problem, and what's at the center of the problem is not working for anyone. And the way that I actually think that we need to confront that, it is when you say there's a cultural problem, we cannot say that there's a cultural problem and not address race, and not address the fact that PPS has had deep cultural and racial conflict over this last decade. And part of it was introducing this racial equity policy and the discomfort that that caused for a lot of white folks and a lot of people who felt villainized through that process, administrators, teachers, district staff. And when you start to push against institutionalized racism, there is a culture that pushes back. And so what I want to say here is that I actually think that we need a superintendent who understands that, who understands what it means to, with cultural competence, be able to work with a diverse group of people and bring them together and rally them around a vision that is centered in equity. That is not easy work to do. I think Carol Smith had the courage to say that the work needed to be done. I don't think she was the person to carry all of that work out. And I think we have not found that person yet. And I think in terms of the superintendent search, that needs to be central to that conversation. I think we have to really think about what it means to have all of these elected groups of people or appointed groups of people who come into PPS, because the reality is that in an elected situation, the majority brings the same group of people to the table. And so instead, I think instead of focusing on elected parents and people who are already the majority, that we need to think more about community organizations. And I think very specifically I went to the work that you're doing right now, just bringing us together. But I think that I went to an event with the Coalition of Black Men maybe a week or two ago. And there were student leaders there from Benson who were interested in what's happening in Portland Public Schools. I don't think if we were to just cast a net that those students would become involved in any committee or anything that they could be elected or involved in. And I think we need to really work with community organizations like the Coalition of Black Men and other organizations like Teaching with Purpose, who already have a sense of who those people are in the community, who are interested in changing and disrupting the status quo and disrupting this kind of majority vote kind of culture that we have in Portland Public Schools. And I don't think that right now, Portland has properly given, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a group of leaders who came before us who pushed for, we would not have the racial equity policy. I feel like sometimes I get really upset when I hear about people talking so negatively about PPS, because when I think about people like Ronnie Herndon and I think about people like Linda Harris, I just think, I'm like, they worked really hard. They sacrificed a lot for PPS to be where it is right now. Our graduation rate's going up, and the work that has happened as a result, not just of these administrators, but of people who were in the community pushing back on what was happening. And so I want to enable that type of voice to come back into this conversation about the health of Portland Public Schools. And I think it's missing right now. So I'll just stop there.
Can I piggyback on that? That's a short bit of time. I really like what you said about, I was thinking about the thing you said about site councils and then the same parents being the loudest. That's always a concern of mine, because I was one of those parents pushing back very loudly for several years over health and safety. And I am asking myself, what way can we engage parents? Because there are tens of thousands of parents in our district, and I feel the same way. I feel like I hear the same voices all the time. How do we engage everyone and not filter all of the feedback through the same 5 or 10 people? And when I hear site councils, that makes me nervous because that is a very small group of people in a very large school being the gatekeepers of information to the district. And that creates problem after problem after problem because there is a parent culture too. There isn't just a culture at the student level and at the teacher level. There's one with parents too that can be very difficult to navigate.
That's right.
And I think as a board member, that is something, I've talked about this a couple other times, that we need to somehow address because it creates a lot of friction in the community.
Answer your question. Then we have one other student question, and then go ahead.
The racial policy states it shall empower students and families. What does empowerment mean to you, and how will you infuse empowerment?
Aside this time?
Go ahead.
Okay. So empowerment to me means that people who are affected get an opportunity to have a voice in what affects them. And as a board member, we need to take that responsibility on. Like, it's not enough for us to come to board meetings and not ensure that we have given other folks who are actually impacted. And I say this personally, I don't have children in the system. And so it's going to be really critical if I sit on the board to ensure that both teachers, parents, kids have a chance to be at the decision-making table. And I spoke to some student leaders from Ally who are feeling a little frustrated right now because they've had an opportunity to advocate for ethnic studies, but now that there's an opportunity to actually make decisions about how it gets implemented in our schools, they don't feel like they're actually at the decision-making table. And so I think empowering people is actually giving, it's making, and I don't know if it's giving because I don't know if it's ours to give, but I think it's ensuring that people have the access to power. And that's our responsibility as board members. It's not just about our power and using our power to make decisions. It's also about giving other people access to the power too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we need to be much more creative in figuring out ways to make that happen, to give students power. I think when we talk about accountability stuff, I think that can play a role. If we can have some, 360 evaluation going on where students and parents and teachers have the right to talk about their experiences, how what's happening in their school actually affects them. I think that might help. I think giving more sort of real institutional status to student organizations. There is SuperSAC as Superintendent Advisory Committee or Council. It's made up of high school students, and it's existed for a very long time, and they elect somebody to represent them on the school board as a non-voting member, but it hasn't been supported by the district, so it hasn't been as effective or it hasn't had the capacity and the support to really be as inclusive and as effective as a student voice as it could have and should have. We need to be listening to students. It's their lives we're dealing with. I think there are lots of barriers to getting those voices heard and allowing people to feel like they have power. And I think we need to do some real analysis about what actually are the barriers and how can we get rid of them. And one of the things you don't do is when you're in a cut budget, you don't cut interpretation services because that's a problem. I think I think we need to be, as a board, we need to be telling central administration, this is a value, this is a very high value, this is a priority item that we need to deal with, and then work on it.
Okay, so I typed the exact same thing you said, Jamila, as you were saying it, that empowerment means giving you a voice or valuing your voice. We don't give that to people. We need to show that we value their voice and not assume that someone else is going to speak on behalf of everyone in the community. We need to teach students that their voices are important and they need to speak up when they see something that makes them uncomfortable, because that's really the space where change is going to be affected. It's so important. And it's one of the reasons working on the complaint process is so important to me, because as a parent, I know how uncomfortable it is to be the one that's knocking on the principal's door when you see a problem with the way they're managing their money, or you see a problem with the fact that there is an invisible environmental hazard everywhere that's not going to be addressed by the district. Challenging a COO who's forced to resign in the middle of, a lead crisis. It is very uncomfortable. There are still people that are angry about it, probably angry with me over not taking no for an answer. And it's so important. I just got a note from another Vestal parent today who has filed a complaint. It was a 30-day complaint process. The window closed yesterday, no response. We have to have a system in PPS that shows that when we are challenged, we are valuing that input and addressing it. The changing of this complaint process is going to be really, really important, because the attitude that we have about it in the central office is the same attitude we're going to have about it in every individual school.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
So this is about students, not parents.
Well, they're my children. So it
the-
is about students and their friends and the children they go to school with. That's the only person that.
So I think the what I want to name here is that we have to decenter the voices, like you said, that continue to make those complaints. And I'm not saying that the complaints need to stop, but that's a separate issue. This issue is about how do we ensure that kids have an opportunity to voice for themselves.
Right.
And narrate for themselves.
And what I'm saying is that
what's
how can
going
we
on
set,
for them.
We can't
Not
do
for
that if we
parents
can't
to
even
do it
set,
for them.
Except that we're not even setting an example as parents in as a central office, because that process wasn't even there until 2014. There is not even a document on the PPS website. It shows right in the middle and right at the top that we don't even value that input when there's pushback as a district. So I don't know how you would expect us to be able to send that message to a student when we're not even practicing it ourselves.
No, I understand that. I just wanted to name that to continue for us to think about what it means for students to be able to narrate their story for themselves.
Well, I think that our perspective is a little bit different, and I think that's a good thing. And I do come at it as a mother and looking at how my children's environment and education is addressed in each school. It's not what you.
I understand that. Yeah.
Thank you, Virginia. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, in terms of empowerment, I think student empowerment starts in every classroom. How is the student engaged? How are you engaged in your learning? And are you engaged in a way that challenges you and gives you responsibility to develop, that gets you curious, it supports your curiosity and your creativity, which is your voice, right? So part of it's just every day in the classroom, what kind of curriculum and teaching practices are there? I've talked a bit about the decision-making different processes that students should be engaged in. I want to push back about the comments about site council. Sure, a site council can be dominated by a group of students who are a clique or a group of parents who are in a clique or whoever, but it doesn't have to be that way. And if we bring the equity lens to how site councils work, which we should be doing, then we can ensure that site councils are representative and are not just closed groups, but are reaching out to us, particularly to parents who are not typically engaged in the school. And really, at a lot of schools, of course, that's parents of color. If you go to a PTA, they're often pretty segregated. Parents of kids receiving special education services are often not engaged in the school community, and especially parents who don't speak English. So we can do that, and I want to get off parents and get back to kids. So we can build those structures, but we also have to be vigilant as to make sure that students are engaged in ways and given the information they need to speak up and make and have an informed voice. And I'll stop there.
Go ahead.
So I completely agree. And to piggyback off of a point that Scott just said, one of the major reasons why parents of students who are on IEPs or who are ELL aren't really engaged in the community is because, or in the school community, is because there isn't the institutional support for those people. And we need to recognize that in order to actually empower all of these folks, we need to, like, again, this goes back to equity, we need to attribute more FTEs to schools that need wraparound services and programs that actually allow us to keep these students fed and happy and in school so that they can do the work and actually feel empowered, right? Like we know that if students show up hungry, they're not going to be good students. They're not going to feel empowered, right? So like lunches are really important and breakfasts are really important, right? Like, so all of those wraparound programs are so crucial to being able to actually do this work. Because we can try and empower students, but if they're not able to eat at home or they don't have the after school care that they need, we're going to have major problems, right? So we need to recognize that actually doing any of this work is more than just the work with the students. It's making sure that they can be supported in their life around that so that they can actually do the work when they need to be empowered, right? So that's an important thing. Another really important thing is that we don't empower students by silencing them with armed security officers. This happened at the school board meeting on Wednesday. This is not acceptable. We cannot silence students who are speaking truth to power, nor can we silence staff that are speaking truth to power and expect them to feel empowered in any kind of way within their community. Right? You have students who are chalking outside the district building about police being in schools and arresting them, and then they're not allowed to come in until they have to go through connections to get the superintendent out to have this conversation, but security doesn't want to let them in because security is retired police officers. Right? Like, we need to work through the system to set up a system that actually will allow students who feel empowered speaking out against power to actually have their voices heard and supported by the institution. And that is really, really important. I think 360 evaluations are great. Those kinds of things are really, really great. But it also goes deeper and wider than that kind of stuff. I think active listening throughout this entirety is key. As a district, as a board, we need to be actively listening and engaging all of our constituents, all of our students, to know what their problems are. So then we can not only give them fish, but we can teach them to fish, and we can teach them to address the problem that they need fish so that they can go learn how to fish on their own, because that's what empowerment is, right? We can't burden students with empowerment if they don't have the supports and if they don't have the guidance.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to one empowered student with, I think, an amazing teacher who has helped her to find her power. Go ahead.
Okay. So what I have to say isn't actually a question. It's just something that I've noticed. So in the framework on page 9, in the section titled Decision Making, it states, furthermore, it is imperative to include students in decision making, impacting their learning and involvement. Right. So I've been hearing about student voice over and over again, but I haven't been seeing a lot of it. And like for me, like to get here where I am, I had to ask a lot of questions. Like these things were not just told to me. Like when I've been participating in like PTA and other board meetings, I'd have to go and ask the questions. This was not like information I had been told. And when I learned that students were like involved in making decision on who represents their zone, I had to ask that question. I wasn't told, and I didn't know it until the end of the school year last week. And I had to ask, like, nobody told me, but apparently that's the thing that they do. And I think student voice is really important. Like, it's really important. At my school, we had this leadership class that has been going on for about 5 years now, and it has really improved our school. So we've been having problems with bullying and like a lot of fights and stuff. So our leadership class put together this group called the what is it called? I forgot the name, but peer mediators. So what we do is we take the place of like a counselor, and instead of having an adult talk to the student about the problems, we go in and we talk about the problems. And I've been involved in that a lot, and that has really improved our school, like a lot. It's improved a lot. There hasn't been as many fights, like there's been maybe 2 fights this year. And last year, there would be fights every other month. So we really improved our school with that. We would go in, we would talk to the students, we would share our own experiences, and then the students would walk out and there would be no more problems. But from my personal experiences, when I would go to a counselor, we would be in there and we would talk about our problems, but it wouldn't change anything. We would still feel the same way we did when we walked into the room. And the problem would still continue after that, and we would continue to have meetings. This happened to me several times. But with the peer mediators, from the kids that I've mediated, they haven't came in. Well, a few of them have come back, but not many. Like, and the problems, they haven't been continuing. We have solved many problems. And
Congratulations.
That's
on
incredible.
yeah.
I want to say, if you look through all this middle grade stuff, peer mediators or that kind of student empowerment, there might be one line in here.
Well, there should be, and that is the result of a framework that's not great. So
I'm sorry, if I could I want to make sure that she's done speaking before we hear responses from candidates.
Okay, it's just this last thing. So in our social studies class, we've been learning about the board, the Portland Public School Board. And one thing that I noticed was that, so we were talking about student voice. And there's a student on the board, I think she's a representative. She goes to Jefferson. And from the meetings that I've seen and I've been to, she hasn't spoken she may have spoken once or twice, but she doesn't speak a lot. And I don't feel like that's student voice. I mean, she's there and she's on the board and she's in the meetings, but I'm in the meetings, but I'm not saying anything. Like, I'm not voicing my opinions, I'm not saying stuff, I'm not making changes. I'm in the room, but I don't have student voice. So I feel like we need to have more students on the board, and we need to have more students actually voicing their opinions and things. And that students are more important. I mean, teacher and parent voices are important, but student voices are more important because it's our learning. The teachers and the parents, they have already learned these things. They've already been through school, and we're going through school. So, and then at the Harriet Tubman, so I went to this Harriet Tubman meeting where we were talking about the principles, right? And we were also talking about the Ockley Green principle. So I had written this little speech, and I was talking about what I would like to see in the principal. And when they appointed the principal that went on leave, I didn't see any of the things I had in my speech. So I had voice, and I said the things that I need to say, but there wasn't any change. It was like they asked for my opinion, but they didn't really listen. So I feel like even if we do have more student voice, people actually need to listen to the student voice. We can't just have them say, oh, so she said something, and yeah, that was great, but we're still gonna do what we wanna do.
Amen, sister.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you were here tonight. And I'm so glad that you took this opportunity to speak to these people here, because it's very likely that at least one of these folks that we're looking at right now is going to be taking that seat. And I hope that each and every one of you takes into your heart what you've heard tonight, and that you carry that with you throughout the next 4 years. Thank you so much. Yeah.
That was great.
So I think that makes a perfect segue into our final kind of discussion on accountability. And that has certainly, if there's been one overarching theme that has woven its way through looking at the middle school implementation plan, talking about the racial equity policy, it's how do we hold this system accountable? So I'm going to get a little bit interesting here. So I'm going to start with Scott, and then I'm going to go to Rita, and then I'm going to go, we'll figure the rest out from there. How about that? Yeah. All right. So again, I will, what I'll do is set my timer for 7 minutes, and then when that goes off, I'll let you know we've got 1 minute left.
Okay.
And tell us what you will do.
Yes.
As a board member.
Yep.
Yes. So what is your plan? How will you affect a higher level of accountability and oversight?
Okay, thanks. And I may bail right after I go because I have another engagement. Number one, the board should hold itself accountable in terms of, we talked about evaluating its own policies that are out there that are supposed to be in place. That should happen on a regular basis. It should be prioritized. Number two, and this is something that I proposed as part of a strategic plan that the district did back in 2000 that died a swift death due to a dysfunctional board and board leadership in the central office, was that every department in PPS in the central office will have metrics. Those will be public. They'll report at least once a year to the board on how did we do, and if we fell short, what are we going to do different next year to fix that? And if we hit all our targets, hey, celebrate. Wouldn't that be nice? Part of that should be a customer service system. So I go to Kaiser for healthcare, and 3 days later, I get a survey in the mail saying, how did we do? And it's kind of long. We could do short ones. So every department has different customers. HR department has teachers as one of its customers. Imagine a teacher going in, they lose your paperwork again. So, but you get that survey a day later, you rate them, and you have a little box when you say, boom, you did it again. And that gets reported to an independent auditor who sums it up and reports it to the administration and the board. That's accountability. That's accounting for what you did or didn't do. And maybe that's a good news. I know that's dwelling on the negative, but it's also the, hey, I went into HR and Chris was fabulous. Want to hear those too. Third thing, we've heard about the ombudsman not being effective. Maybe the ombudsman should report directly to the board. And then they're not reporting to an administration, which sometimes doesn't want to hear bad news. And that we do a little more empowerment there. So those are three things specifically. Again, we've talked about principal evaluation, that drifts down into teacher evaluation as well. Teachers need to be held accountable. And let me just give one more example. The board overturned DBRAC's proposal for redrawing boundaries on the west side, and they did it themselves. They've never gone back and looked at what they did. And I gotta tell you that some folks may not know that at Chapman School in Northwest Portland, the kindergarten is a mile away from the school at the Ramona at a low-income housing development. The kids have to walk about a half mile to get to a place where they can do recess. That there's a high-rise condo going up right across the street from that kindergarten with lots of vibration and noise off and on. And they took a self-contained classroom that had been at Chapman for years and was integral in that community and moved it to Hayhurst, which is miles and miles away. We balanced their enrollment on the backs of some of our most vulnerable students. And I don't see anybody holding the board accountable for that. Except for me right now, calling it out. So that's, that kind of accountability needs to happen, where the board needs to be held responsible for looking back at the decisions that they've made and having those be evaluated.
What do you think would be the mechanism for that? Who holds the board accountable besides the public every election cycle?
Every board to be successful needs a community that is organized. It goes hand in hand. So one of my core values is these are public schools. We're the owners. And we have to act like owners, not like absentee owners. Oh, we elected Scott or Virginia or whoever to the board. Our job is done. It isn't. Democracy is a contact sport. So we can't have that kind of, that's the community side of this. And we're not very organized, frankly, on the community side. We push more than we talk and listen. And that's a whole nother discussion. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank
you for being here,
Pretty
Scott,
close.
and staying as long as you could.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
And I did bring the
You did bring the tent. I wasn't sure if Karanja had brought the tent. That's the Courageous Conversations tent. For those who have not been a part of Courageous Conversations, that's the racial equity program that we have within Portland Public Schools in order to try to forward our equity work. Although, as some members have mentioned, it's a lot of conversation. Okay, Rita, would love to hear your plan for how we can hold the district accountable.
Okay. So let me do sort of big picture first, and then some details. So I'm going to go back to the culture change thing. We have had a series for as long as I've been paying attention. We've had a series of school boards who had a particular view of what the role of the school board was, and it was pretty hands-off. It was mostly sort of being cheerleaders and kind of rubber stamping whatever the superintendent wanted. And I believe that the school board has to be a much more active, hands-on, really engaged governance body. The job of the school board is to run the district, is to supervise, oversee the district. It's the job of the superintendent to actually manage the district. But it's the job of the school board to hire and supervise, and potentially fire, the superintendent. That means that the school board needs to know what it wants to do, what kind of district we need to have. And then it's got to make sure that it establishes an understanding with the superintendent about how that vision is going to play out, how it's going to be implemented throughout the district. And then the board is supposed to adopt policies and budgets that are aligned with that vision, okay? So I think the first thing that we need to do as a new board is to establish a common understanding of what the role of the board is going to be. It is, board members are not supposed to be developing programs, not supposed to be, we're supposed to be at the policy level, at the system level. And I think one of the major things we have to do is to demand that PPS transform its organizational culture. We need to have a school district that embraces transparency and honesty and is responsive to students and educators and parents and the larger community. We need to have a board that is that is curious, that actually asks questions, that doesn't sit there and, you know, nod at the PowerPoints and walk away saying everything's swell, because they told me it was swell. It is stunning to me that board members for years and years and years never asked questions. Finally, they're starting to ask questions, but we're not getting a lot of answers, frankly. So I think the board needs to be much more active. In terms of specifics, I would say if I were on the board, one of the things I will say to the new superintendent, and this will factor into what kind of superintendent I think we need, PPS is a system with no systems. Everybody's in charge, nobody's in charge. It's hard to hold somebody accountable for doing a job when they don't actually know what the job is, because they don't have job descriptions. This is management 101. So we need to establish, you know, sort of normal operational functions within the school district, and that's sort of job number one, I think. We need to, I would recommend 360 evaluations for pretty much everybody. And I think we can include the school board members in that too, because I'm pretty sure people have views.
What?
Yeah. And it would be nice to get some feedback that doesn't appear on the front page of a newspaper. Ombudsman, I think that the ombudsman position has been, you know, it's a dead letter at this point. So I think if we're going to keep it, and I think we should, we need to transform it, and I think having it report to the board is a good idea. We have, in terms of principals, in addition to 360 evaluations, we do have mechanisms that, I was on SACIT, the Enrollment and Transfer Committee, and one of the things that we did was that we changed the transfer policy so that it's no longer done by lottery. You have to petition, and part of the petition is that you have to make your case. So theoretically, we should be hearing, the Enrollment and Transfer Office should be hearing why people are going from school A to school B. What's the problem? Because we have some schools that have a tremendous amount of churn, both in and out. What's up with that? This can be an early warning system, and it's not necessarily in order to punish a principal, but to alert the principal to a potential problem, and to provide support for a principal who may be having difficulty with something. I mean, that would be a revelation within PPS. PPS doesn't support anybody to do a better job. I think we need to enforce the policies we've got. We need to have, we need to build in an evaluation function that has actual measures that matter, that mean something. The board evaluates the superintendent once a year. And at the beginning of the year, they establish metrics. This is what they've done for the last 10 years or so. And the metrics are ridiculous. They are not even remotely actionable. There are things like improve the graduation rate. That is not a reasonable metric to evaluate performance over the last 12 months. You need to have performance measurements and an evaluation criteria that actually will allow you to evaluate performance in the last 12 months and identify any weaknesses, identify areas that need improvement, identify areas where it's just been, bang on great. People need feedback, and we have not been giving it to them. We haven't been giving it to anybody until the axe falls, at which point it's useless. And finally, I think I would say we have to, this is my last thing, in order to have transparency and real feedback, honest feedback within PPS as a whole, we have to ensure people's safety. I am hearing more and more about reprisals for anybody who makes noise. I am hearing students who are being targeted for disciplinary action because their parents have said something. That is absolutely unacceptable. And it's part of the whole culture change that I think we need. This is my last chance to say something, so I'm going to say this. I can be pretty critical, and have been, but what I will say is PPS is totally fixable. PPS has the promise of being a great urban school district. We still capture 85% of our students in this city. We have great teachers. We have people in the headquarters who are dying to do a good job, but the system won't let them. We can change this system, and we can change it fairly quickly, I think.
Thank you very much, Rita. I'm going to go to Josie, Jamila, and then Virginia, I'll let you close out.
How long do we have?
I'm going to, 7, and then that's a 1-minute warning. So 8 minutes. I'll give you the 1 minute.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. So first of all, I want to speak to, that was amazing what you said before, and I feel that so strongly. I have been in a smaller capacity, but still in a very similar vein, a student representative on a faculty board. I was the student representative when I was in grad school in my grad faculty committee, and I basically was a fly on the wall. And the student representative at our school board is basically meant to be a fly on the wall. It's very window dressing-y, and it's not at all empowering student voices. And so I think it's really, really important that a major thing that we can do and address with policy is how we structure our board. So pulling it back to sort of this question about accountability and policies and what can we do and what do we need to do new and what do we need to leverage old stuff. I think there's a lot that we need to talk about in terms of who is actually on the board and how they're representing the district. And I think that's a big picture conversation, but it needs to involve students. We need to be able to involve students on the board in an actual capacity. Right? Like, even if they don't vote, which I think they should be voting, I think there should be student representatives that are voting on the board. But even if they don't, they should be speaking in conversations. They should be driving conversations. That's really, really important and an important voice. And so I think that's a crucial thing about what you were talking about that I think really needs to be called out. Related to that, I think another thing that I would like the district to think about in terms of its representation going forward is who votes for each school board member. Each zone is defined in terms of who the representative is and where they live. The entire city votes for that person, votes for that zone. That's not representational government. That's not appropriate representational government. Appropriate representational government is you have a ward or a zone or whatever, and the people who live in that space vote for the person representing them, right? When we have a racist, colonial Portland, Oregon, we have a racist colonial group of people voting for the entire school board, right? That it's no surprise to me, despite the racial makeup of our city, that there is currently one person of color on our school board who is an actual member of the school board. That's a problem, and we need to address that. The school board needs to address that. We need to tackle that head on so that we can actually be accountable to our actual constituents. Also really important about new policies, I would like to see the board develop a conflict of interest policy that includes nepotism and contracting. I would like the board to be devoid of any capacity to engage in any company that is contracting with the district in any capacity. I am a small business owner. I do contracting with governments. I understand how important little conversations behind the scenes are and how important that influences contracting. And I know how our district mismanaged contracting that happened recently that cost a minority-owned business real money and real opportunities. And the district only owned up to it because somebody else called them out about it. That's a problem. The district is not being accountable. The district needs to set standards and policies that address these issues that could be continuing to be issues going forward. I think things like 360 reviews across the entire district are great. I think that's really important. I think that's a necessary way to evaluate everybody's involvement. I think students should be evaluating each other. I think students should be evaluating teachers. I think teachers should be evaluating students. And I think we should be counting all of this stuff, right? Like, as I said before, I'm a numbers person. And to step it back and really generalize things, the way you are accountable in any sense is you're clear in your objectives. You tie your objectives to actionable items that actually make sense, to Rita's point. You tie them to metrics that can be followed up. You follow up on those metrics, and then you repeat, and you repeat, and you repeat, and you repeat, and you repeat ad nauseum, because this is a process. Accountability is a process. It's not a buzzword. I mean, it is a buzzword, but in reality, it's a process. And it's not a thing that we do one time. It's a thing that we always have to be doing, because we always need to hold ourselves more and more accountable to the realities that other people are bringing to us, right? We're going to deal with one problem, and then another problem is going to come. We're going to need to be accountable to everybody in all of those issues. I think it is really important, Scott has mentioned this before a number of times, that there are issues in general with the strategic vision and plan of the district and that overarching set, and I think that's really important. I think in general, our central office needs more staffing. We have continued to cut administrative staffing and support in our central office, and while it's easy for us to say the district is broken and kind of point to a building and the people that work in the building, really it's the board who's staffing that building, who's putting fewer people with more tasks and asking them to do more and more, and then pointing at them when they're not doing more and doing it better. Like, we need to be real here. Like, we are cutting their staff too, not just teaching staff. And these folks are overstressed and overworked and are trying to do their best. We, as a board, need to be accountable in how we staff things and actually staff things to meet the needs that those positions have. Right? Like, that's real. And that comes back to, like, what's a position description? Like, we need to have those so that we can actually hold ourselves to what that person should be doing, so the district can actually be giving them the support, putting the right number of bodies in those kinds of positions. In terms of existing policies that can be leveraged to get some of this stuff done, I think it's really important to recognize that there is a policy that is the board member duties, and it clearly outlines what the board is supposed to be doing, right? And like, number 5 on individual board members is to become informed about the district's educational program and operations, visit schools, and request information from staff. Like, that has the beginnings of an actionable set in there. We're supposed to visit schools. We're supposed to request information. How often should that happen? If that doesn't happen, what are the consequences? Like, there's a beginning part here. We can leverage what the board's legal responsibility is that we're saying we want to do to actually hold us accountable to, right? So there's beginning points here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in translating policy into practice, but there's a lot there. And the really other important thing is our access to public records policy, which basically says everything needs to be accessible, right? It's basically a sunshine approach. We are doing horribly at that. As someone who's relatively new to Portland, relatively new to PPS, I've been trying really hard to get as involved in lots of different capacities, including Googling on the website a lot of different things, and I can't find it. I can't find the racial makeup or any kind of makeup of our staff, right? Like, where's that information, right? Like, how do I, as somebody who's interested in helping to empower different parts of the district, find the information that I need to be able to do that work? It's not there. We need to hold ourselves accountable, and that's really, again, by staffing that. Somebody needs to do that. Those are person hours, FTE hours. So we need to get those people in those positions and empower them to do that work and support them with it, right? So again, it's this administrative staff stuff that we need to support through additional funds and professional development and all that kind of stuff. So I think accountability is a buzzword, yes, but it's a real thing, and it's a process, and it's a reality that we can do. But where we are right now is far from being accountable as a district. We are relying on students going to the media to talk about slurs being written in bathrooms because the principals aren't listening to the students, right? Like, that's a problem, right? We need to change the culture. We need to imbue a sense of community and working together to educate children, and we need to all come into it with that goal in mind.
Thank you, Josie. Jamila.
Yep. All right. So where Josie left off, I'll start there. I think it's important, well, not exactly where you just left off, but one of the things that you just said is where I'll start. So the position of board members is defined. And when I think about where the board has actually lived into this, it is not up to the bar that has been set. And some examples of what I found, I heard you read something, it was different. So now I'm like, I'm probably working off the wrong document. But again, it's a challenge of where information is right now and how transparent it is to the community. But one of the things here is that supposed to set explicit goals and priorities for the district and ensure that staff carry out and that students and community are aware of the goals and priorities. So one of the challenges that I have is when I look at the board committees. So the board committee is where a lot of the content and substance and discussions happen. And one of the ones that I have had a really close eye on is the teaching and learning committee. And both for 2015 and 16 school years, the goals that the board of teaching, or the board committee for teaching and learning focused on is school climate, principal placement, instructional hours, graduation issues, high school issues, and testing and assessment issues. Those are lists of things. Those are supposed to be goals. Those are not goals. And so in my mind, this is actually the work that the board has got to invest time in the fall. There need to be some very clear and specific and measurable goals, not just for the school district, but also for the work that the board is spending time doing. Because if we need to have systems and we need to have conversations, that happens through the committees. And right now, this is unacceptable. I mean, if I was managing any person who turned this into me, I would throw it back in their face and be like,
I'm wondering, like, what are high school issues?
Right.
Yeah.
Or
What are tax
what is,
right.
how do we actually do something
It's too
about
broad.
it? So I just want to say that first. Like, when I think about accountability and oversight, like, the board needs to be accountable for the responsibilities and the expectations that they've been charged to do. And so I think that as this new board transitions, the 3 people who come on and the 4 people that are staying, it's going to be critical to really spend some time ensuring that a very robust and specific strategy is put together with some defined goals. And I would say that this is even before the superintendent gets here, because we know that there's a superintendent that needs to be hired. And I think that the board still needs to think about in advance the goals that need to be in place. And that's because the board is responsible for hiring, setting goals for, and evaluating the superintendent. So that means that the board actually doesn't have to wait for the superintendent to be in the seat, that this is work that the board does because the board has the vision. The board sets the goals. The board is a group of folks who are focused on the policy making and setting up how to monitor for that. And so I think that there's probably a need to contract with some external consultant, and clearly not the same person that allowed for whatever this is to be written out. And that there's a new person that comes in, because I think it's going to require some serious consultation to get the 7 individuals to align and address the many challenges that PPS is facing right now. I also think that the board needs to readdress these expectations and protocols, because it is clear there's like some different versions floating around right now. And and I think the last thing that I would say on this is that, so if you go on the board materials site, there's all these performance audits that have been conducted since the late 90s. And then in 2013, it just stopped. Mm-hmm. And we have an audit committee, and the audit committee needs to readdress these performance audits and determine, and from what I've gathered, there has been a deprioritization of having an external performance audit. And I think as a result, that's why there's so much crisis management, because there's actually no strategic thinking based off of some set topics and some deep analysis, because we can't solve problems unless we do the analysis to identify what's really happening. And I don't think that we're gonna just, the ombudsman and some of the complaints and some of those are one set of data. There has to be some sort of other, I've lost my words. There has to be a balancing of the different data points so that we can make sure that we have a full perspective on what the issues are that we're dealing with, including making sure that student voices are brought into that process. Because I could imagine if we're not having a more robust audit, it's very easy to lose the voices of students because we're only focusing on the loudest complaints or the loudest issues. And it seems like that's what the audit committee is doing right now. They're kind of focusing on these crisis emergencies versus actually having some really robust performance audits. So I think those are probably the two biggest areas that as a board, I think we have to do. And that's making sure that we set some really specific and measurable goals, hiring a consultant to help do that in the fall before the superintendent arrives, and reinstating some sort of audit, using the audit committee to do some performance audits on some key issues next year. And so I think that, the other broader issues I would agree with, like we have culture issues and we have some other areas that we have to focus on. But one thing that I will say is, we're not going to ever operationalize our mission if we don't focus on racial equity. We say at Portland Public Schools that we want to make sure that every student has the potential to achieve, and it's the responsibility of our school district to give each student the opportunity and support to do that. And right now, we are not serving all students well. And so I think in addition to what I've stated here, there's a broader commitment that the board has to make around this racial equity policy and making sure that we're actually thinking critically about how we're going to achieve this mission for all students in our district. And I think that's it for right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Jamila. Okay. Last but not least, you get the last word tonight, Virginia.
Well, accountability, and I'll probably say a few things that you've already heard. That is a flagship issue for me because I believe it's one of the most pressing issues facing our district right now. And an accountability plan, it's often called a matrix. It's not glamorous sounding, it's not sexy, but it's exactly how we measure our successes. And it's,
I'm sorry, could you just say that again?
An accountability matrix.
Okay, sorry.
No problem. But that's how we measure our success. And it's how we provide a critical pathway for feedback from staff and from the community and from students. It's how we identify a way and the need to pivot away from bad policy. So an accountability plan has to be implemented in a way that provides collaboration when setting educational goals at every level of the PPS organization, from superintendent to principals to staff to teachers. And it addresses the low employee morale that you're talking about that really is plaguing the district. And part of the reason that we have a half-empty central office, it's not just because, we've cut positions, it's because people are choosing to leave. And that's not what we want. We want people to be highly engaged and excited to come to work at PPS every day. We want our students to feel the same way. And this is the only way we can ensure that happens. And it's also the 360-degree process is a way to develop trust in the process and in the people that are part of the process. So as a board member, I would like our new superintendent to require employee and staff input for program goals and corresponding metrics for success. Employees should be part of deciding what those metrics are, because then they're accountable to the metrics and the goals, and it keeps them engaged. A clear annual staff evaluation process that allows for feedback for those that are being evaluated. And again, I keep going back to this, it provides an atmosphere for everyone to be engaged. This is so important to me because I was a community member who was caught up in a horrible accountability process, and because of it, students were put at risk. I know we're all sick and tired of talking about lead. I never thought I would see the day when we were sick and tired of talking about lead because no one would listen. There was no complaint process. There was conversations that we're not going to fix this. There were conversations that we can't afford it without even getting an estimate for cost to address these schools. And while this is happening, we have students that are in danger. It was a horrible situation. It's so important to have this pathway because those employees that were involved should have been held accountable then, and they weren't held accountable until 3 years later. That's too long. I agree with everything you're saying about access to public records. I have filed a complaint with the district attorney because I wasn't able to get public records from PPS. We should be very forthcoming with those records. We don't have anything to hide. And I love what our student over here, I don't know what she's doing, but I love what you said about student input. And as a mom, I can see that sometimes we need to get out of the way of our kids, especially as they are, approaching high school age. I think by speaking, you came up with a really great idea about like what is the role of the student board member. If we have an equitable curriculum across every high school that actually has leadership classes that we can tap, every high school is going to have one in order for this to work. But if our student board member was the conduit for feedback from the leadership classes across your school, and these leadership classes are acting in the way that you're describing as peer mediators, it's an excellent way to get that feedback that you're talking about and create that feedback loop and take it to the board. I love that idea. And by speaking up tonight, you just did it. So I'm really impressed. So I just want to say that I think that that's something as a board I would want to see, right away. We got to get that class in every school immediately. So thank you.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah, I just wanted to add too that that's actually, if you look at restorative justice work, that's an essential component of restorative justice. And I think one of the problems is, again, it's implementation. We have these great ideas, but when, say, restorative justice bumps up against your daily schedule, and maybe that student isn't ready to go to class, right? Well, it's like, oh, well, you got to go to class, right? So it's a question of what are we really prioritizing? Mm-hmm. Are we prioritizing our students or the thing that we had in mind that must work no matter what, right? But yeah, so and that gloss on restorative justice, right, misses out on this critical component that I have yet to see implemented mm-hmm. in any of the schools I've been in where we've been talking restorative justice, but we don't have peer mediators, so.
Well, this is
I believe you were taking notes, right?
Well, it's such a tactical way to ladder it right back up to the board, and that's how you get that visibility. I think it's a really good idea.
Can you imagine if this was our board? All of them right here. All of you guys have tremendous experience and expertise. I think all of you guys can bring something very unique and something very powerful to the board. From what I heard, I didn't know how I was going to vote until tonight. So now I know how I'm going to vote. So I appreciate you guys taking the time out to just give us what your plan is on these very important topics. These are topics that, like I stated before, that can go beyond the election, right? So I hope all of you guys, even though you're not elected, that you will stay engaged because you have tremendous amount of expertise and what you can bring. So please stay in a position of being an advocate, even though you're not elected. I still want to continue to engage with you guys, despite if you are elected or not. Just from what I've learned and what I heard and what I was just soaking everything up, and I truly believe all of you guys have something very valuable to bring to the board, just based on what I heard today. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I definitely felt like I got an education tonight. I learned new things about the way that things are supposed to operate and the way that some things do operate. And I too, was wondering, what we would hear, and I really heard thoughtful responses from everybody here, and I'm truly impressed. And I feel like no matter who ends up where, I think we're going to have some folks that are truly committed to turning this thing around for our kids, right? And that's where we started talking about this. This is about our kids. And that is the bottom line, is that we've got to put all of our adult issues aside and look at what it really is going to take, right, in order to meet the needs of our students in this district. So thank you guys very much for your time. We also want to mention, the Urban League really helped.
Can I say thank you?
I was just going to say,
because I know that you both are heavy responsibility working with kids, working with teachers, and I just want to thank you for turning this around so quickly. And we've done a few forums together, and I feel like these topics were the most substantial in terms of allowing us to get in depth and not just like have a broad stroke overview on a bunch of stuff. So thank you for the way you organize this.
And the best discussion, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
I mean, okay,
Yeah.
so can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
So 2 years from now, there's going to be another election.
Yeah.
Do it, but do it earlier.
Yeah.
We've got a little more time to plan. I want to give a shout out
breakdown in the middle of the week.
to Karanja because we talked after this conversation that came up on social media, and we had a conversation, and right then and there out of that conversation it was like, well, how can we turn this into a bigger discussion? So I really appreciate you for pulling the trigger and just jumping right on it, Karanja, and finding a sponsor in the Urban League who helped us.
Urban League, thank
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
Urban League, for last minute sponsorship to be able to put this on. It is a cost. It is a cost that uses venue, and they were able to step up to the plate to sponsor this the cost of this event. So thank you again, and I'm very hopeful. My spirit is high. I'm saying, and
Amen.
To respond to the reason why, this is what happens when you have educators, when you have teachers that organize things that have to do with education. You have to engage us. So if you are elected, engage teachers, engage students. We are the end product of this educational system. So so this is the result when you engage students, when you engage teachers in the process. You're going to have things that are organized, action steps, things that we can actually do something that's tangible, make an actual difference in our system. And that's what the purpose of this forum is, and that's what our heart drives. That's the reason why we became teachers and educators, is because we want to make a difference. So thank you again. So and it is exactly 7:56. So that is the time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting us.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Clap it up.
So